When privilege meets reality, and the cameras keep rolling. In just 35 seconds, one comment would unravel an entire interview and expose an attitude that shocked everyone watching. This is the story of how Prince Harry went from celebrated guest to persona non grata on Jon Stewart's show, and it all came crashing down faster than anyone could have imagined. The night started with all the usual energy you would expect from Jon Stewart's show. The studio audience was buzzing with anticipation. Prince Harry had been making headlines for months with his various media appearances, and getting him on the show was considered a major booking. The production team had worked for weeks to coordinate the interview. Everything seemed perfectly set up for what should have been an engaging conversation about Harry's charity work, his life after stepping back from royal duties, and maybe some lighthearted banter about adjusting to life in America. Jon Stewart walked out to thunderous applause, flashing that knowing smile that his audience had come to love over the years. He delivered his opening monologue with the sharp wit everyone expected, touching on the day's news before pivoting to introduce his guest. The audience erupted when Harry's name was announced. He walked out onto the stage with a confident stride, waving to the crowd as they cheered. The two men shook hands, and Harry took his seat across from Jon at the desk. At first, everything seemed fine. Jon started with some easy questions, warming up the conversation. He asked Harry about settling into California, about the weather differences between London and Los Angeles, about learning American customs. Harry laughed and shared some amusing anecdotes about getting used to coffee orders and tipping culture. The audience was eating it up. These were the kinds of relatable moments that made for good television. But then something shifted. Jon, being the skilled interviewer he is, started to dig a little deeper. He asked Harry about his various media projects and how he chose which stories to tell. It was a fair question, the kind any journalist would ask. But Harry's response had an edge to it. He said, "Well, Jon, I think when you've lived the life I've lived, then you earn the right to tell your story, however you see fit." Jon nodded diplomatically, but you could see something flicker across his face. He followed up by asking if Harry ever worried about oversharing, or if there were boundaries he tried to maintain. It was a softball question, really, an easy opportunity for Harry to show some self-awareness. But instead, Harry leaned back in his chair and said, "I don't think someone like you could really understand the pressure of having the whole world watching your every move since birth." The audience went quiet. You could feel the temperature in the room change. Jon Stewart, to his credit, kept his composure. He smiled and said, "Well, I've had a few cameras pointed at me over the years, but you're right. I can't imagine what that's like from childhood." He tried to move the conversation forward, asking about Harry's charity work with veterans. This should have been an easy topic, something positive they could discuss. Harry talked about his foundation and the various initiatives he'd been involved with. Jon listened attentively, and then asked what inspired him to focus on mental health support for veterans specifically. It seemed like a respectful question, but Harry apparently took it the wrong way. He said, "You know, Jon, I actually served in Afghanistan. I was actually there, not just sitting in a comfortable studio talking about it." The audience gasped. Jon's eyebrows shot up. He sat forward slightly and said, "I have tremendous respect for your service, Harry. I've spent a lot of time advocating for veterans myself, as you probably know. I was just asking about what drew you to this particular cause." His voice was calm but firm. He wasn't going to let that slide completely, but he was still trying to keep things civil. Harry seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Sure, you've advocated. That's great. But advocacy and actually putting on the uniform are two very different things, wouldn't you say?" The way he said it, the tone, it wasn't just offensive. It was dismissive, almost mocking. Jon took a breath. You could see him making a decision in real time about how to handle this. He said, "You're absolutely right. They are different things. I never claimed otherwise. I just think we can all contribute in different ways, and asking questions about your work isn't diminishing it. It's called an interview. There was an edge to his voice now, but he was still professional. The tension was thick now. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence. The producers were probably panicking in the control room. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go, but it was about to get worse. Jon, trying to salvage the interview, pivoted to asking about Harry's family and whether he had any plans to visit the UK soon. It was meant to be a gentle topic, a way to ease the tension. Harry's face hardened. He said, "I'd rather not get into family matters with someone who makes jokes for a living." The audience audibly reacted to that one. There were scattered sounds of shock and disapproval. Jon's face remained neutral, but his jaw tightened. He said, "Well, Harry, you've been talking about your family matters in every interview and documentary for the past few years, so I assumed it was on the table. But we can move on if you'd prefer." Harry shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to back down. "The difference is, I choose when and how to discuss it. I'm not answering questions from someone who spent decades making fun of people like me for ratings." That was it. That was the moment everything fell apart, and the moment that 35-second countdown had been leading to. Jon Stewart sat back in his chair. His expression changed from patient professionalism to something else entirely. Not anger exactly, but a kind of steely resolve. He looked directly at Harry and said, "People like you. That's interesting. You know what, Harry? I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, activists, soldiers, survivors, people who've actually changed the world. And not one of them has ever sat in that chair and talked down to me the way you're doing right now." The audience started clapping. Not the polite applause you hear on talk shows, but real supportive applause for Jon. Harry looked stunned. He clearly hadn't expected this kind of pushback. He started to say something, but Jon held up a hand and continued. "I've spent my career holding powerful people accountable and giving voice to those who don't have one. You came on this show, agreed to this interview, and now you're acting like I'm somehow beneath you for asking basic questions. That's not how this works." Harry's face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. He said, "I don't have to sit here and be lectured by you." Jon nodded slowly and said, "You're absolutely right. You don't. In fact, I think we're done here." The audience went silent again, but this time it was different. This time everyone could sense what was coming. Harry stood up, pulling off his microphone. But Jon wasn't finished. He said, "You know what the really sad part is? You actually had important things to talk about. Your work with veterans is genuinely meaningful, but you couldn't get out of your own way long enough to have a real conversation. You came in here acting like the world owes you something just because of who your grandmother was. That's exactly the kind of entitled attitude that people are tired of." The audience erupted in applause again, louder this time. Harry stood there for a moment, clearly processing what had just happened. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he seemed to realize that anything he said now would only make things worse. Jon turned to the camera and said, "We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have someone else who actually wants to be here." The producers cut to commercial, but the damage was done. Harry walked off the stage without another word, leaving his microphone on the desk. The audience could see him disappearing backstage, and they could hear Jon taking a breath and shaking his head. When they came back from commercial, Jon was alone at the desk. He looked into the camera and said, "Well, that was unexpected. Let's talk about something else." But before moving on, Jon addressed what had happened. He said, "Look, I want to be clear about something. I have nothing but respect for anyone who serves their country in uniform. I have nothing but admiration for people who use their platform to help others. But respect is a two-way street. You don't get to come on someone's show, in their house, and treat them like they're inferior because you don't like the questions. That's not how adults behave." He paused and then added, "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've been yelled at by politicians, cursed at by celebrities, and challenged by some of the smartest people in the world. But I've never, ever been treated with such casual contempt as I was just now. And I think that says more about our guest than it does about me, or this show, or anything else." The audience gave him a standing ovation. Jon smiled, thanked them, and then moved on to the rest of the show as if nothing had happened. But everyone watching knew they'd just witnessed something remarkable. They'd seen someone with enormous privilege and access completely self-destruct on live television because they couldn't handle being treated like everyone else. What made the whole thing even more striking was the contrast between how the two men handled themselves. Jon had remained calm, measured, and professional, even as Harry became increasingly defensive and rude. He'd given Harry multiple opportunities to recover, to steer the conversation in a better direction. But Harry had chosen to escalate instead of de-escalate. He'd chosen to assert his status rather than engage as an equal. The thing is, Jon Stewart had interviewed plenty of controversial figures over the years. He'd sat across from politicians he disagreed with, celebrities with difficult reputations, and activists with unpopular opinions. But he always treated them with respect, as long as they showed up ready to have a genuine conversation. That was the unspoken agreement. You come on the show, you engage honestly, and everyone comes out better for it. Harry had broken that agreement. He'd come onto the show with an apparent chip on his shoulder, looking for offense where none was intended. Every question Jon asked, no matter how benign, seemed to be interpreted as an attack. And when Jon pushed back, even gently, Harry responded with increasing hostility. It was like watching someone determined to be the victim in a situation they were actively creating. Think about the questions Jon asked that set Harry off. He asked about media projects. He asked about charity work. He asked about military service with respect. He asked about family in the context of Harry's own public discussions. These weren't gotcha questions. They weren't designed to embarrass or trap. They were exactly the kinds of questions any interviewer would ask. But Harry treated each one as if Jon was personally attacking him. The comment about Jon making jokes for a living was particularly telling. Harry seemed to view Jon's career, his decades of work holding power accountable and giving voice to important issues, as somehow less legitimate than his own experiences. Never mind that Jon had built his career from nothing. Never mind that he'd earned his place through talent and hard work. Never mind that he'd used his platform to advocate for veterans, first responders, and countless other causes. To Harry, in that moment, Jon was just a comedian, someone not worthy of basic respect. And that was really what it came down to. Harry walked into that interview apparently believing that his royal background, his military service, his personal struggles, whatever it was, made him special, made him above the normal give and take of an interview, made him immune to basic questions. And when reality didn't match that expectation, when Jon treated him like any other guest, Harry couldn't handle it. Jon's response was a masterclass in standing your ground without losing your cool. He could have matched Harry's energy, could have gotten angry or defensive, but he didn't. He stayed calm. He stayed factual. He pointed out the contradiction in Harry's behavior, the hypocrisy of someone who'd spent years publicly discussing his private life, suddenly claiming those topics were off limits. And he did it in a way that was firm, but not cruel. When Jon said they were done, it wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a power play. It was simply a recognition that the conversation had become unproductive and disrespectful. He wasn't going to sit there and be insulted in his own studio, on his own show, by someone who'd agreed to be there. And the audience's reaction showed they understood and supported that decision. What's interesting is how quickly it all fell apart. The interview probably lasted less than 15 minutes from start to finish. Within that short time, Harry managed to alienate the host, the audience, and anyone watching at home. It's almost impressive in its efficiency. He could have had a perfectly fine interview, promoted his work, connected with viewers. Instead, he chose confrontation. Looking back at the exchange, you can pinpoint exact moments where things could have gone differently. When Jon first pushed back on the comment about not understanding pressure, Harry could have laughed it off or acknowledged the point. When the military service comment landed badly, he could have clarified what he meant. When Jon tried to move to family topics, Harry could have simply said he'd rather focus on his charity work. There were so many off-ramps, so many chances to course correct. But Harry didn't take any of those off-ramps. Instead, he accelerated toward disaster. Each response was more defensive, more dismissive, more hostile than the last. It was like watching someone deliberately sabotage themselves. And through it all, Jon gave him space to recover. He didn't interrupt. He didn't talk over him. He let Harry make his choices and dig his own hole. The moment when Harry pulled off his microphone and stood up was particularly striking. It was such a dramatic gesture, so final, but it also felt juvenile somehow. Like a child taking their ball and going home because the game wasn't going their way. A more mature response would have been to acknowledge the tension, maybe even apologize for the heated exchange, and try to end things on a better note. Instead, Harry chose to storm off. Jon's comments after Harry left were equally important. He didn't gloat. He didn't mock. He simply stated facts. He acknowledged his respect for military service and charitable work, while also making it clear that those things don't excuse rude behavior. He drew a line and explained why it mattered, and he did it in a way that was about principles, not personal attacks. The standing ovation Jon received said everything about how the audience felt. They weren't applauding because they enjoyed watching a guest get kicked off. They were applauding because Jon had stood up for himself and for them. He'd refused to let someone treat him, and by extension his audience, with contempt. He demonstrated that respect matters, that civility matters, that how you conduct yourself says something important about who you are. Throughout the entire disaster, Jon never raised his voice. He never insulted Harry personally. He never made it about anything other than the behavior in that room, in that moment. He stuck to what happened, what was said, how it made him feel. And that's the mark of someone who's secure in themselves and their position. He didn't need to puff himself up or tear Harry down. He just needed to state the truth. And the truth was simple. Harry came on the show and behaved badly. He was condescending, defensive, and ultimately disrespectful. When called on it, he escalated rather than apologized. When given the chance to recover, he chose to leave. Those are just facts, not opinions or interpretations. Anyone watching could see exactly what happened. What made the whole thing so compelling was the contrast in how the two men carried themselves. Jon was confident without being arrogant, firm without being aggressive, clear without being cruel. Harry was defensive, entitled, and ultimately self-defeating. One man showed strength through composure. The other showed weakness through inability to handle basic scrutiny. It's worth noting that Jon had nothing to gain from this confrontation. It would have been easier to let the awkwardness slide, to move through the interview with bland questions and avoid conflict. But he chose integrity over ease. He chose to stand up for himself and his show rather than accommodate someone's bad behavior just because of their status. That's leadership. The way Jon ended his comments after the break was perfect. He didn't dwell on it. He didn't let it dominate the rest of the show. He said what needed to be said, then moved on. That's professionalism. He gave the incident the attention it deserved, no more and no less. Then he got back to work, proving that the show was bigger than any one guest or any one moment. This interview will be remembered not for what was supposed to happen, but for what actually happened. It became a perfect example of how not to conduct yourself in public, how not to treat people who are trying to help you, how not to respond when you're challenged. And it became an equally perfect example of how to maintain your dignity and principles when someone else loses theirs. The 35 seconds that changed everything came early in the interview. That's when Harry made the comment about Jon not understanding pressure, not knowing what it's like to have the world watching. That was the seed that grew into the disaster. If Harry had just answered that question differently, if he'd shown even a hint of self-awareness or humility, everything that followed could have been avoided. But he didn't. He chose to make it about status, about hierarchy, about who had suffered more or earned more respect. And once he went down that road, there was no coming back. Each subsequent comment just dug the hole deeper until finally Jon had had enough and pulled the plug. And really, what else could he do? You can't have a conversation with someone who refuses to engage as an equal. The lesson here is clear. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, or what you've been through. When you agree to be someone's guest, you show respect. You engage in good faith. You answer questions honestly. You treat the host and the audience like they matter. Harry failed on all those counts, and he paid the price for it. Jon Stewart, on the other hand, demonstrated exactly how to handle a difficult situation with grace. He gave Harry every chance to succeed. He tried to move past the awkward moments. He kept his cool even when being insulted, and when it became clear that the situation was untenable, he ended it cleanly and explained why. That's how professionals operate. This moment will stick with people because it was so raw and unexpected. Talk show interviews are usually carefully managed affairs. Everyone knows their role. Things stay pleasant and surface level. But every once in a while, the mask slips and you see something real. That's what happened here. The carefully constructed image fell away, and what we saw underneath wasn't pretty. Harry came on that show to promote his work and his image. He left having damaged both. Jon came to work ready to do his job, to ask questions and have a conversation. He ended up teaching a lesson about self-respect and professional standards. It's not the show either of them planned, but it's the show they'll both be remembered for. One man revealed himself to be entitled and unable to handle basic scrutiny. The other revealed himself to be principled and unwilling to compromise his dignity for anyone. The contrast could not be more stark, and the audience made it clear which approach they respected. The whole episode raises questions about celebrity culture and what we expect from public figures. When someone has lived their entire life in a privileged bubble, surrounded by people who never push back or challenge them, they can lose the ability to engage with others normally. They forget that conversations require mutual respect. They start to believe that their experiences are somehow more valid, more important, more worthy of reverence than anyone else's. Jon Stewart's show has always been a place where that kind of thinking gets checked at the door. It doesn't matter if you're a president or a prince, a CEO or a celebrity. You come on, you engage honestly, you treat the host with respect, and you have a real conversation. That's the deal. Harry either didn't understand that deal or thought it didn't apply to him. Either way, he learned otherwise in the most public way possible. The timing of Harry's meltdown was also notable. It happened so quickly that there was no time for handlers to intervene. No commercial break to reset. No chance to salvage anything. One moment they were having what seemed like a normal interview, and the next moment, everything was falling apart. That speed is actually revealing. It suggests that Harry's defensiveness was right there under the surface, ready to emerge at the slightest provocation. For Jon, this was just another day at work in some ways. He'd dealt with difficult guests before. He'd navigated tense conversations and awkward moments. But even for him, this was different. This was someone so completely unwilling to engage on equal terms